to my computer. Well, thank you. Look, good to be here. We've got a nice intimate group today. I'll keep my eye on what's going on in the people entering in. If we've got more, then that's great. We are going to record it and, as I said, share it out there. So I'm Ali Uren. I'm going to set it up and I'm going to put it over to Malvika to introduce herself before we start. I am the founder of Kickstart and the Circular Workplace. So our mission is to make sure that we're not wasting human intelligence, but actually putting it into, we do have Albert, that's awesome, that's great, that we're actually turning it into real economic outcomes as well. So I'm actually just joined by Albert. I didn't expect to see Albert because it's in the middle of the night, but I do. Certainly great to have you here, Albert. Thank you for joining us as a co-lead as well too. As I said, I didn't have, I know it's the middle of the night, so I didn't have great expectations, but it's good to have you here. So Albert and I have taken on, I'm just miming as I have to let people in. Albert and I have taken on the role of joint global leaders with Hacking HR to set up a new learning pod around organisational, or HR as an organisational catalyst for innovation. So this is our first event that we've done. So we certainly, HR, Hacking HR's platform's evolving. There's things to be tweaked and whatever, but we needed to get this out into the world and start working, with our community and bringing these conversations together. So it's great to see people joining us and lovely to have you here as well. So Malvika, I'm going to put it over to you to introduce yourself, and then we're going to set the day up and get into it, yeah? And it is interactive as well. So if there's something, we pose a question, you want to contribute, you've got a question, you need clarity, please, let's have that conversation as well too, yeah? So Malvika, let's just set the scene. Tell me what you love, what fires you up, what are you working on at the moment? Give us a little bit of insight into your what you're doing at the moment, your company, your reason for being. The big question.
Of course, my raison d'être. Hi everyone, I'm Malvika Jetmalani. I am based in Chicago, and I am the founder of Atvis Group, which is a human capital advisory firm driven by the core belief that to win in the marketplace, businesses must first win in the workplace. So what I'm working on right now at the moment, Ali, is lots of executive coaching engagements. I work with clients on translating AI through the human and the leadership and the governance lens. So I'm also working with clients on AI transformation and getting their organizations ready for AI transformation and building AI-friendly cultures. I do a lot of speaking and writing on those topics as well. So all of that is my 9 to 5, and my 5 to 9, as I like to describe it, is I run a community called Women Shaping AI, which Ali is a founding member of. So thank you for your leadership there, Ali. And Women Shaping AI really exists. It's a global community of over 300 women from over 10 countries, and it exists to equip women with the knowledge and the access and the networks to thrive in this age of AI. So anyone who's interested in joining us and learning more, it's free to join, can visit womenshapingai.com to learn more. So that's me.
Excellent, thank you. So Malvika, I know that, I'm going to share this, so we're going to record it. We're going to put out a document or a handout that Malvika did send me initially when we were preparing for this. And it's really the 6 pillars that we're going to do a high-level discussion and overview of today. So I'm going to share that with people afterwards as well too, so they can come back and refer to that. But we wanted to do something, if we're going to talk about innovation as a catalyst for HR, we really need to start understanding, well, what does it actually mean, right? Like, how do you actually start to identify that your organisation is in a place to even make this happen, yeah? So Malvika was kind enough to put together, from her expertise in insights, 6 key pillars, yeah, that will shape and determine the success of being able to do that. So the first one that we're going to go to, and we're not going to be able to, obviously, because of time, and be able to cover every single point, but we're going to, as I said, we start with some structure, and we're going to be fluid, and we'll see where it's going to run from there. But the first structure in this, or pillar, yeah, that we want to talk about today and get people to engage with this on, is around strategy and focus, Malvika, yeah? Well, where will we innovate and why? Right. So going right back to the foundations. And you brought up a very interesting term here, which people will see when they get this handout. A term that I actually haven't heard before, called the innovation thesis. The innovation thesis, yeah? And tell me what you mean by that. And what does an innovation thesis mean from a practical HR perspective? Tell us what that means. So if we've never heard about it before, right, just set the scene for us, particularly from a strategic perspective. What is that?
I was inspired by the idea of an investment thesis, right? Because so many organizations, especially private equity and venture capital firms, have an investment thesis. And I work mostly with private equity backed companies, so that's where the inspiration came from. So an innovation thesis is, I think, a point of view where an organization believes that innovation will create disproportionate value. And so it really answers three questions. Which problems matter most?
Yep.
Where do we believe we as an organization can create a step change in value? And also, what are we deliberately choosing not to pursue?
Yeah.
So that third question is very important because most organizations skip that step.
Yes.
They say they want innovation or transformation, but they don't make explicit choices. They want to do everything. And the result of that is what I call innovation confetti. So you dozens of yes, yes, you end up with dozens of disconnected pilots, or you have little to no strategic coherence or way to make trade-off decisions.
Yes.
And you have a lot of activity without momentum or without creating actual business value. And so if we look at an innovation thesis from an HR lens and ask our questions, what does that mean from an HR perspective? In HR, an innovation thesis should be grounded, one, in the business strategy, and two, in your highest friction people problems or people matters that you want to solve or improve. So, for example, if you're a hyper growth organization, and you're struggling with slow hiring or hiring manager burden, or your talent acquisition process is outdated, your HR innovation thesis might be something like, we believe we can create competitive advantage by redesigning talent acquisition and maybe even internal mobility through AI-enabled matching, skills-based workforce planning, and I don't know, manager self-service. And so what that does is it's immediately creating clarity. So it's saying we will prioritize skills architecture, internal marketplaces, right? AI assisted recruiting. And you're also saying we're not going to spend time on lower value experiments like a chatbot that answers basic HR policy questions. So I think the strongest innovation theses are specific enough to guide investment decisions. So they become sort of a filter. So when a new idea comes along, which in most organizations, there's no shortage of ideas, right? So when that new idea comes along, leaders can ask, does this idea really advance the thesis? Or is it just something that's simply interesting? And there was a recent interview that MIT Sloan did with Kraft Heinz's head of agile transformation. And she described how they learned that strategy is not just about what you do, it's also about what you stop doing, right? So we've known this for a while. Strategy is as much about saying no to things as it is about saying yes. And their teams at Kraft Heinz originally had as many as 20 active projects. And what they found ultimately is through a bunch of experimentation, they found that the golden number for them was 7. That was for Kraft Heinz. That doesn't make it the golden number for everyone, but they found that that was the right number for them. And by enforcing that discipline of saying no and cutting the projects down from an average of 20 to an average of 7, they were able to reduce their product launch cycles from 36 months to 6 months.
Yeah.
And if you worked in consumer goods, you know just how fast
Yes.
6 months is. So there's real business value attached to saying no and to prioritizing ruthlessly.
So
But I'd be interested in your and other people's
yeah,
definitions or thoughts on an innovation thesis and what
yeah.
that looks like in HR.
Absolutely, and please put your hand up, take yourself off, you come and join us. It's a two-way conversation, absolutely. Look, you know that I've always spoken a lot about high-value work, and that's where we start, yeah, to begin with. Tell me, though, now, Vika, if the leaders today on the call, people want to actually start to make that discipline part of the everyday operations, what type of skills and talent and capability needs to be there? Yeah. So if we can just come back for a minute before we move forward to our second pillar, what do we need from an actual practical perspective, from a skills-based perspective, to make that discipline, that clarity actually happen day to day? If you had to look at maybe, let's say, the top three talent or gap or skills that leaders need to be developing, not only in themselves, of course, because this is a collective effort, right? The team needs to be building this capability, right? Like innovation can't be a bottleneck. What would you say if you had to? The top 3 to 5, and we'll just give a brief overview into those if we can.
So is your question, what skills or capabilities do we need to develop if we want to become an innovative organization?
You're particularly around the innovation thesis. Let's just go there for a moment. Let's just go.
Got it. Okay.
Is that all right?
Okay.
Sorry, Mal Becker. It's early for me. It's 6 a.m. Go kind, everyone.
No worries. I just want to make sure I'm answering the right question.
Just that bit. So if that's where we're going to start, absolutely crucial. Yeah, you cannot do it all. You need to own something. Yeah. So what does that mean? Not just a leader, not just from the leadership skill set, the team skill set.
Yes. So from an innovation thesis perspective, I think the first skill or capability that you need to develop is what I describe as meta learning. So learning how to learn. I think that is one of the most important skills that we will need in this new era of AI that we find ourselves in. So many of us stopped learning with our formal education years, right? So learning how to learn is going to be a very important skill, especially because the volume and pace of change is only continuing to accelerate. And today we have AI, tomorrow we might have quantum, right? Even if you look at the AI tools that are available to us today, there's new models coming out every day, new tools. So learning how to learn is going to be a really, really important skill that we need to cultivate, both in individual contributors and in leaders. And then from an innovation thesis perspective, obviously learning how to say no and ruthless prioritization, as I like to call it, is an important skill. I wrote a whole article last year on ruthless prioritization. So if anyone is interested, just send me a note on LinkedIn and I'll send you that article.
Right,
and there's some real kind of tangible action steps in there that you can take. Right. And ruthless prioritization always takes me back to Steve Jobs, who did have some questionable leadership practices, but built one of the most valuable companies of our time, right? And he would often tell Joni Ive, who is the chief designer, what have you said no to lately, right? And he often said, it's easy to say no to bad ideas. You have to say no to the good ideas so that we can focus on the great ideas, right? So that developing that skill and flexing that muscle of saying no is really important. And then the other thing I would say is this idea of solving the hard parts of the problem first. So what do I mean by that? So there was a podcast episode that Simon Sinek did last year with a gentleman by the name of Astro Teller. And Astro Teller is the head of Google X, which is Google's moonshots innovation arm. So they work on like the really big moonshot like transformative innovation projects. And so he is an innovation expert. And he talks about this idea of working on the hardest parts of the problem first. And the example that he gave was, if you wanted to teach a monkey how to stand. Your project is to teach a monkey how to stand on top of a 10-foot pedestal and recite Shakespeare. That's your project. What are you going to do? Build the pedestal first or teach the monkey how to recite Shakespeare first, right? And most of us with sane intellectual honesty would say, train the monkey first, because that's the hardest part of the problem, right? That's the hardest thing that we need to solve. Without that, nothing matters. You could have the best, most beautiful pedestal in the world, and it doesn't matter. And yet, if you go inside organizations and look at the work that is actually happening, people all across the world are building pedestals, beautiful pedestals. And we go to these all hands meetings and we applaud the monkey pedestal team and we say, look, we're 50% of the way there, right? The project is 50% complete. And we reward people and give bonuses and give acknowledgements and applause and recognition based on that 50%. But we don't ask ourselves, was that 50% the hardest part of the problem? And so I think we need to get better at solving the hardest parts of the problem first and identifying the hardest parts of the problem first. And then the last thing I'll say is I think we need to get better at defining the success measures or the success criteria up front so that when the time comes to kill a project or kill an idea, we have a rubric on which to make that decision. And we're not making those decisions based on how emotionally attached someone is to an idea or a project. So I think that's a good starting point. But again, I'd love to hear what others think about what skills and capabilities you need to build.
Absolutely. Let's do that if you want. And Vika, there's so much in this. And as I said, that's why I love working with you, because it's always rich and it's challenging and it makes you think. So thank you. So if you do have, you can leave questions at the end. You can join us now. I think the point is, now, Vika, just before we move on to that second pillar, is that discipline piece, and how we actually design the organisation and the roles, right, and the day-to-day. We're thinking about skills, but not the roles around that. So I'd be encouraging, and again, that's a whole other topic, but how do we actually design the roles to be able to allow that to happen and have it as a supported, expectation as well too. So again, success metrics, understanding what they are, and you need to know what they are, obviously, before you hit it, and particularly if you're in a high-pressure situation, right? And there's either a crisis or it's quite it's high stakes. You don't want to be then trying to work out, what does this actually look like? What is the criteria? How do we measure this? So I really think innovation is risk management as well too at the same time, right? It just looks different, but that it has so many elements of it as well too. So if no one's going to ask anything at the moment, that is cool. We're going to move on to the second pillar because I'm mindful of time. The second pillar that we are going to be talking about in terms of, is your organisation ready to actually innovate? Because everyone wants to talk about it, but the reality of doing something with it is completely different. Psychological safety was your first point, in that mix, in that pillar, right? So again, people are going to get a copy of that document or the 6 pillars. Tell me how you've seen this, right? So again, psychological safety is talked about a lot, but how do you actually make it work, right? So again, you touched on a few things in your first response, Vika. We have pressure to learn, we have pressure, we have pressure to learn more, to do more, we have expectations. We're going into areas that we've never been in before. We are, if we're going to have the conversations that we just spoke about in that first pillar, that's going to mean calling things out that are not working, right? We're going to have to talk about things that make us vulnerable. We're going to have to talk about mistakes. We're going to have to talk about near misses. Maybe we're going to have to talk about relationships that are not working, right? Like we have to look at it holistically. So for you, how do we create mentally well environments? Because you don't innovate if you're full of fear, right? You just don't. You can't, right? You don't have the imagination, the bandwidth to do it. If we were to say, okay, where do we look then to create psychologically safe workplaces, to be innovative, to be ingenious? Where do we start? What does that need to look like? It's a really big question, but without that, none of this will happen.
Absolutely. I think first, it's important to define what we mean when we say safe, because psychological safety doesn't mean we're going to lower the bar. It means we're creating an environment where people can surface their concerns, voice dissenting viewpoints, admit uncertainty, report near misses, challenge assumptions, right? And especially when you look at high stakes industries like healthcare, aviation, defense, financial services, right? The most dangerous or unhealthy cultures are often those where people are afraid to speak up. But the best cultures are ones where they sort of successfully pair safety with accountability. So, one really practical approach that I have found, and it works in practice, and I've seen it work in many organizations, is separating the people from the problem or the process. So instead of blaming people and at the first sign of an issue, asking who did that or who was responsible for that, asking what caused this issue, and going through a what we call in continuous improvement RCCCM, root cause countermeasure. So going through a root cause countermeasure approach of not only what are we going to do to solve this problem today, but what is the countermeasure that we are going to install to make sure that the problem doesn't recur in the future. The other thing that I have found that really helps to build psychological safety is, a lot of organizations do postmortems. So after a project, they will get together and talk about what worked, what didn't work. And that's a really helpful exercise. What I also love is pre-mortems. So bringing the team together to discuss, okay, we're about to embark on this project or this initiative or this transformation. What do we think could go wrong? And so anticipating the obstacles or anticipating the risks and talking about what are the countermeasures that we are going to put in place to mitigate some of that risk. So, for example, if someone takes a thoughtful risk and shares what happened and helps the organization learn, that should be rewarded. So we also need to make sure that our reward systems and our recognition mechanisms are designed for psychological safety. If someone repeats the same avoidable mistake because there's no learning that occurred from a past experience, then that should also be addressed. So there are two sides to that coin, right? You have the psychological safety, but you also have the accountability part of it. And in healthcare organizations and even in manufacturing and other high stakes, high risk industries, you have things like after action reviews or near miss reviews, right? So that's really important. And going back to that podcast that I talked about earlier with Astro Teller, what he describes is at Google X, when a team killed their idea or they shut down their project, they are celebrated. They get a standing ovation at the all hands meeting, and they get large bonuses because they found evidence that suggests that their idea will not work. And so that is a very powerful signal that at Google X, that learning is more valuable than ego, right? And so the cultures, I think, that innovate the fastest are not the ones that are focusing on avoiding the mistakes. They are focusing on detecting and discussing and learning from those mistakes as fast as possible.
So that's great. So for me, it's about, if I look at in my own space as well, if we just sort of start to connect the dots across a couple of these pillars, we have the high value work that we spoke about in the first part of the conversation. So being disciplined, understanding where the value is, what we're the unique category or space that we own, understanding and identifying what that looks like from an actual evidence-based approach. So, and then being able to map that back to the role of the project as well too. So we're connecting the dots, Malvika, across, what can look quite strategic and quite big picture, but then translating that into how we're going to be delivering the role in the project and then measuring that ongoing. Are we on the same page here?
Absolutely.
So
That's a great
that's how I would
summary.
normally, we're interpreting it, right? We are connecting
Yes.
those dots. And I see that innovation, it is a connected ecosystem too. Awesome. Let's move along. I think we're nearly at 6:30. Time flies when you're having fun. And we're nearly at where we are. We're at our third pillar. Yeah? Such a big topic. We could spend weeks on it. We can't. But we're going to talk leadership, the leadership pillar, the leadership role of innovation. Yeah? And one of the key areas that we have always discussed and that we're going to pull out today for the group to have further discussion around if they want is around the role of sense making, leaders' role in sense making as it becomes, as we talk about speed, learning, innovation, and risk. Yeah. So tell me, what is the role of leadership in being able to create that narrative around innovation and move it from just story to actually everyday reality? What's the role of leadership in sense making? Can we start there?
This is such an important question because narrative clarity is not the same thing as certainty, right? So often, and I find this really in my executive coaching work more than anything, leaders conflate those two things very often.
Yes.
And what your team doesn't need is they don't need you to have all of the answers to every problem and every question. They don't need you to pretend that you know exactly what will happen and look into your imaginary crystal ball. What they do need is they need you to help them understand what problem are we trying to solve? Why does it matter? That why is really important, right? Simon Sinek's book, Start with Why. What do we know? What do we not know yet? And how are we going to learn? And I think the most effective leaders are very comfortable talking about what they don't know. And they're very comfortable navigating uncertainty or navigating ambiguity because they're very comfortable saying, I don't know. We don't have all the answers, but we know the direction, we know the principles, we know our organization's values and how we tend to operate and what's important to us. We know our innovation thesis, right? Going back to our first point. So we know which trade-offs to make. And so we will use those processes to help us navigate this uncertainty and we will get through it as a team. So that kind of narrative creates confidence in the team without creating a false sense of certainty.
Yes.
And during uncertainty, I encourage leaders to organize their communication around 4 topics. What is changing? What is not changing? What are we testing or learning? And what does that mean for you right now? You being the stakeholder. It could be the employee, it could be managers, it could be your executive team, it could be board members, and that you changes depending on the conversation. So the same message will need to be shared or communicated differently based on that stakeholder. And so I think Microsoft is a really good example here. So they are using this type of approach when they're communicating their AI strategy internally, and their leaders have been very explicit that the company is still learning, but they also have a North Star, which is not about automating jobs. Their North Star is about augmenting human capability and redesigning work. And so people are very clear on what that North Star is. So I think people can tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty. What they cannot tolerate is silence. When you give them silence, they become anxious and or make up their own narrative or stories. So I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and can I also say too, just in case if people are interested from a change perspective, symbolic convergence theory is a term. It's about the art of myth making in organisations. So if you haven't heard it before, symbolic convergence theory, it is real. You do need to know how to influence it and shape it. I'd encourage you that you have a look at what that is and how it's showing up. Before we move on to the 4th pillar, I just want to talk a little bit more about ambiguity if I can. I think it's incredibly relevant. It's always been relevant, but in the world in which we're living in at the moment, because let's be real, we have ambiguity in our life. We have it in our work, yeah. People do bring themselves and their life to work too, yeah. So for leaders who want to really remove those sources of ambiguity where they can, there are some that can't be removed. And as you said, Malvika, that's when, obviously you are very clear and proactive and on the front foot. But what do you think we need to be aware of that can act as a roadblock to being able to be proactive and effective in being able to tell that narrative? Like, what do the leaders here need to be aware of that they might not even recognise in their own practice or organisation at the moment that can get in the way of being able to remove sources of ambiguity where we can? Because we need to, if we can, where we can, yeah. What sort of roadblocks can exist to doing that? Just if we can get a response to that, and then we're going to move on to our fourth pillar.
I think the number one thing is self-awareness. And you'd be shocked at how many leaders lack self-awareness. So the number one thing you need to be aware of is yourself and what your own motivations are, what your biases are, which ideas or projects you're attached to, what your own career aspirations are, right? Because often your career aspirations guide or inform your decisions and your priorities in the moment.
Yes.
And when you can master that self-awareness, so much of the leadership job becomes easier and simpler. And if you don't have self-awareness or you are not aware of your blind spots, there are so many ways to create that awareness, right? An easy way is ask people, ask your team for feedback. When I work with teams, people who report to me, in every one-on-one, I ask for feedback. Upward, we think about giving feedback to people, but upward feedback is just as important, right?
100%.
So what am I doing well? What do I need to do better or differently? And how can I support you better? Just 3 simple questions, right? And that alone can open up a dialogue with your team around how you can support them better. Ask your manager or your skip level manager, ask your peers, ask critical stakeholders that you work with within the organization. Ask your favorite AI tool, right? One of my favorite questions to ask AI is, based on everything that you know about me or based on all of the conversations that we've had, point out the key patterns in my ways of thinking, and also point out my strengths and my blind spots or development areas.
Yeah.
And often it'll give you at least a starting point that you can begin with and take that data to the key stakeholders and say, this is what the AI said. What do you think? Right? So you don't have to go through a formal 360-degree review.
No.
You don't have to go through a big exercise to create a little bit of self-awareness and gather some data points around what you could be doing better or differently as a leader.
And Malvika, thank you for that. And I think it's also fair. Not all of us have the same sort of relationships with people. Yeah. So we need to think about, perhaps I need to be building that trust and that connection before I'm even able to ask those questions, because that's the reality sometimes too. Yeah. So this can be compounding over time. Yeah. How do I start to introduce dialogue, different type of conversation into our teams, into my one-on-ones, into my informal conversations? How do I just get people comfortable? Because if you're going to ask the question, you do need to be prepared for the answer. And I think the self-awareness piece is absolutely critical, but one that needs to also somewhat be built over time if the relationships don't allow for that initially. So, no, that's excellent. Okay, we're moving. We're nearly halfway there. I better put my foot down slightly. And thank you, everyone, for asking questions, and Malvika for sharing articles. And again, we're going to post and share extra resources and that. Yeah, we're going to connect in and so forth. So just yeah, that'll be good to be able to continue this conversation. Fourth pillar, everything. It's everything. It's our people. Yeah, it's our workforce. So the first question that I want to really tackle here in regards to this pillar, right? We're laying foundations now. We've come to the people bit. How do we create a learning environment? You talk about mentoring, right? We talk about skills first, skills-based organizations. But how do we, if we're going to innovate, how do we create an approach to developing the capability building in AI and otherwise that allows us to keep pace, but minimize the risk of overwhelm. How do we find that balance? Because I think it's absolutely critical. Yeah, and you know, part of my space for the last 18 years has been how do we do that in very complex environments to be able to get the right economic outcomes that are also healthy for people without that risk to the business, the people, the brand, and so forth. How do we do that? How do we find that sweet spot?
When I go into organizations, there are some key themes that usually come up in leadership conversations, and there are some key themes that come up in employee conversations and in conversations with middle management and frontline leaders. And the top theme that continues to come up in conversations with non-executives is this idea that my company is asking me to learn and experiment with AI on top of everything that I'm already doing, on top of this never-ending to-do list of meetings and initiatives and projects, right? And how can I possibly find the time to do all of it? And so if you don't address that question or that concern, that can very easily create resentment, burnout, right? And so the most effective organizations that I have worked with and also read about are doing three things. They're creating protected learning time. They are connecting learning directly with real work. So embedding learning into the flow of work rather than having it sit, outside of the flow of work as a one and done sort of training program and then saying, okay, we're done. We trained everyone on AI.
Disconnected, yes.
Disconnected. And the third thing is they are rewarding application, not course completion, not sort of a check the box activity. So for example, when Duolingo last year sent a memo to everyone and said, we're an AI first company now. We're going to be AI first. That there was a trend, if you remember last year for a few months, all of these big companies were sending memos and declaring we are now an AI first company. What I appreciated about Duolingo's approach is they said to their people, we want you to, and we expect you to spend 10% of your time learning AI and experimenting with AI tools. And if you need help with that, reach out to your manager or reach out to any leader within the organization. So they created an explicit expectation. So that's one thing you could do. There's also a lot of organizations that are creating team-based learning challenges. So, you and I have talked about this before. We are social beings, right? We learn more from each other than we do from sitting through a self-directed e-learning course, right? Because we exchange from the dawn of time, we have learned from each other because literally our survival has depended on it. And so we exchange ideas, we feel more comfortable asking each other questions. And so creating those team-based learning scenarios that tie to real business problems can really help. And then the third thing is recognize managers who develop their teams and help their teams adopt new skills. And so when Kraft Heinz, again, going back to that Kraft Heinz interview that I mentioned, they emphasized coaching in the flow of work rather than relying on formal training programs. So that's what they did when they wanted to improve capability. And the last thing I'll say is, I do think it's important from a talent mobility perspective to create cross-functional teams. The problem in most organizations is we are built in silos, right? We have HR and IT and operations and finance. Each function has its own language, their own incentives, their own worldview, et cetera. But I think some of the most successful AI projects that I have seen include not only the technology leaders who understand the tools and the tech, but also the HR leaders who understand the employee experience and the org design implications, and the operations leaders who understand the process and the workflow, and the legal and compliance leaders who understand the constraints. So I think building cross-functional Teams and learning pods.
Mm-hmm.
Apple, Microsoft, Spotify,
Mm-hmm.
these companies are really good at that. That can really help build not just talent mobility, but build new capabilities within your workforce.
Now, this is awesome. And like I say, I'm very mindful of the time, and it's always a rich conversation with you now, Vika. One point I want to say, based on my own experience and research, this is fundamental to the point that we must move from a me mindset, yeah, which has been traditionally how skill development has been. It benefits the individual, yeah, to a collective we. That is what we're talking about here. So when we're capturing these elements of learning, of intel, of mistakes, of insights, ideas, it's now being repurposed across the business. It doesn't sit with the individual. Yeah, innovation is it's not an individual pursuit. So I think for me, I see that as being something that is again economically beneficial for the individual in terms of career prospects. Yeah, never has it been more relevant at the moment, but also a key part of changing how we manage risk in the organisation as well. So I'm going to keep going. This is awesome. We are onto our 5th of 6 pillars, the operating model. Yeah. So how does the system, and you alluded to it briefly before, but how does the way in which we design our organisations, what do we need to be mindful of? If we say we're going to innovate, where does smart speed? Because everyone talks about fast, right? I always say fast is good for hamburgers, but not necessarily for business and innovation in your people. Yeah. So how do we design an organisation? What are some of the key factors that we need to consider if we're going to be able to design for speed but smart speed now, Vika, as part of the pursuit of innovation? Big question at the end of your day.
Yes, yes.
Big question
Big
at the
question
beginning of
for
mine, all
sure.
right? And big question for everyone
Yeah,
who's with us.
yeah.
But
Well,
tell me,
we only ask the big
well,
questions.
that's what we do. And if
So
you don't want those, then don't come here and don't be part of our learning pod. But you are, and we
yeah,
love having you. So come back
yeah.
again. But we need to, this is where the value is. Yeah. So take us, just give us as I said, in the time we've got here, where do we start? Where would you put the energy into, if we even looked at the top, maybe, even one or two, just a bit of time, the top one or two design consideration.
I think one of the smartest things that you can do in terms of design principle is separating the explore work and the exploit work.
Okay,
Because most organizations try to run innovation with the same rules that they use to run their existing business.
Mm-hmm.
And their existing or current business might value things like efficiency, predictability, quarterly results, risk mitigation, right? Whereas innovation requires experimentation, it requires comfort with ambiguity. It requires rapid learning cycles and tolerance for failure. And so when those two modes of operating are forced into the same system or the same operating model, your current business is always going to win. And that's why agile teams often struggle because they're asked to move quickly, but they're still operating within the same cycle of annual budgeting and multiple approval layers and fixed KPIs and long decision chains. So going back to the Kraft Heinz example, they addressed this issue by creating smaller, more autonomous teams. And that allowed their teams to move 5 times faster. One of the most important things that they did is they moved from this system of hierarchical approvals to quarterly reviews with just 2 to 3 senior stakeholders. And so that helped them create that speed. And it also preserved the oversight mechanism without creating bureaucracy. So that is, if I could just talk about one thing when it comes to operating model, I would say separate the explore from the exploit and think about explore and exploit as the analogy of the factory and the lab, right? So the exploit is the factory, the explore is the lab. If you try to run a factory like a lab, you're going to create chaos. And if you try to do the opposite, nothing will get done. And so it's important to have that separation.
Yeah, awesome. Tell me, so the explore versus exploit. that then leads us to the final pillar before we then open up and do a wrap up and say where to from here. So all of this ultimately is about trust and connection, yeah, and honest dialogue and the transparency and openness as well too. So it takes us to our final pillar. We're nearly at 10 to, well, maybe 10 to the hour, 10 minutes to the hour. The sixth pillar that we put into this and that we're going to address today is governance and trust. And they're massive topics. But how do we move? How do we innovate? Because innovation, as I said, is really a change of our reality, isn't it? Right? Like it's a changing of the cultural construct and the narrative and how we show up in the world, right? And leaders ultimately determine, help shape the standard and set the standard for our cultural experience. So how do we move with smart speed? I try and avoid the F word, the fast word, because I think it's filled with so much risk, but we've got to, smart speed. How do we do that? How do we actually do that without breaking trust and putting organisation and people at risk from a governance perspective? This is our last pillar for today as part of our launch event, Malvika. So do you want to bring that home for us before we go and wrap up and where to from here?
Sure. So when it comes to governance and trust, I think the first thing I'll say is try to decentralize if you can, because that's very important for innovation. And this kind of ties a little bit into the operating model point, but it's also a governance point. So when you decentralize and you empower people, especially on the front lines, and you give them the authority to make day-to-day decisions within a defined, range or within defined parameters, you create more trust, but you also create that smart speed of innovation that you're talking about. So I've talked about this example before, but I love the example of Ritz-Carlton. Ritz-Carlton is obviously a luxury hospitality brand. They have hotels and resorts all across the world. And they have a policy where their employees can spend up to $2,000 per incident to resolve guest issues without seeking management approval. And so what that does is it reinforces that customer orientation, that customer first mindset. It also enhances agility, right? So they can move fast
Yes.
and move smartly, to your point. And of course, it strengthens the brand's reputation as a leader in the hospitality industry. So I think decentralization is very important. And then also good guardrails need to be clear and practical and proportionate. They don't require 10 committees
Yes.
and 7 months of review and approval and 14 forms that need to be signed, right? You give people clear and simple rules that help teams move faster. So, for example, if you are using AI, your ethical guardrails might include things like we don't use protected characteristics in hiring or promotion decisions. We require human review before high impact decisions. We require transparency about when AI is used, and we require clear standards around data privacy and security. So the key is you want to build these guardrails into the process and you want to build them early in the process so that you can use them as gates in your stage gate innovation process rather than bolting them on at the end. So I often, the way I describe it to leaders I coach is think of ethical guardrails as your sort of lane markers on a highway. They make it possible to move fast because you know exactly where the lane markers are. So you can move fast with confidence because people know where the edges are. But also when people need to safely make a lane change, they know how to do so. So that's how I think about governance and trust.
Beautiful. So I've got a really good question here I want to give to you. Vidya, thank you for giving us that. So do you have any advice for leaders who might face a hard time giving that freedom, that autonomy to employees? I'm thinking of leaders who are used to being on the operations side and are transitioning to the strategic side. So how do we move leaders to be able to come from operations to strategic? And again, changing up that, and I don't like the term power or control, but changing I suppose, the dynamic between themselves and their staff. And if they're struggling for that, Malvika, what could be some practical advice on how to address it? Thanks for that question.
One of my managers said to me early on in my career, he said, I was a new leader and I was struggling with delegation, as many
Mm.
new leaders do. It's a classic problem. And he said to me, you know, if someone on your team can do 40% of the task or do it at 40% of what you would do, you should delegate it. Because you might, yes, you might sit with them and you might have to invest time in showing them how to do it. But in the long run, not only are you freeing up your time and capacity to
Correct.
work on bigger, more strategic things, but you are creating a bench of talent and a bench of people who are only going to get smarter and more
Hmm.
capable.
Hmm.
So if it's not enough to just bring together a group of talented people. Those talented people have to work as a cohesive team and unit. And they have to be able to take the good ideas and the investment and turn them into real business value. And that's not going to be possible if you hold on to every decision and every task. So, my practical advice would
Yeah.
be identify something that you can give to your team that they can do or make decisions around. And if they can do 40% of the
Yes.
job that you
Yes.
would do, just do it and invest the time up
Yeah.
front to teach them and show them and sit desk side with them to
Yes.
do it.
Yes.
And in the long run, you'll be much, much happier that you did.
Yeah, I think, like you said too, delegation is capability building. So it's a fundamental part to how we build talent and to disperse that talent throughout the organisation. So again, it is a critical part. Yeah, thank you, Malvika. It is a critical part of modern day risk management. Not that you would normally think about delegation as being that, but when we do exactly what you said, we disperse that talent, that intel, therefore decreasing risk as well. Now, Vika, I've got a final question for you, then I'm going to throw it open to the group and we'll wrap up. So this is a very quick fire question, yeah? And thank you for your input. If we're going to start to consider, and not just consider, but act on the intel, the ideas, the opportunity that have come from the discussion today, what are we going to need to change about how we think about and respond to modern day risk? Couple of minutes, can I get you to do that? Is that all right?
Absolutely. I think one of the things we need to change is our mindset around failure.
100%. Yeah, that's
I think a lot of leaders say that they want innovation, but they are not prepared to handle the the failures or the headwinds that come along with being an innovative
correct.
organization. It goes with the turf, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to to sort of stop or avoid demoralizing your workforce or your people, make sure you're communicating to your people that stopping a project is not failure, it's evidence-based learning. And by the way, and you talk about this a lot, right? The knowledge and the talent and the assets that are created by that project don't disappear.
No.
So going back to the Google X example, so whenever they shut down a project, all of the teams retain the code, the patents, the lessons, the relationships, so that future efforts can start smarter and they're
Yes.
not starting from scratch. And they call this moonshot compost.
I
So
love that.
they yes, and so they
No,
what
really.
they've done is they've reframed that ending of a project from a loss into an investment into the next iteration, which I think is really valuable.
That's exciting. And you know me, and that won't surprise you that I'm off to do some research on moonshot compost, yeah, because nothing's wasted. Yeah, zero waste work. We talk about
Yes.
circular economies, we need circular workplaces. And that's where we're starting from. So look, we've got about 4 minutes left. I just want to say thank you, Malvika. We've had it's good to see people here. And I know as we start to, build the community, we'll see obviously more as well. And it doesn't matter. It's about the people that are here and the quality of the message. And we've got Lizia from Hacking HR. So thank you for joining us today. And Albert, my co-lead from Indonesia, I think it's the middle of the night over there. So I'm very happy to see you and everyone that's joined us today. Albert, thank you. It's the beginning, so it's good to get this one under our belt. And of course, we're going to be putting it out there, the recording, some additional resources that we want to share as well too. So I just want to thank you for coming along. Is there any pressing questions? As I said, I hope we get to connect in on LinkedIn. That's where you'll find me most times. Malvika, if people want to obviously tap into that intel of yours in different ways, where will they find you?
Of course, you can find me on LinkedIn. I will share a link to my profile in the chat here so you can connect with me if we're not already connected. Or you can visit my website, atvisgroup.com. That's atvisgroup.com. And if you want to join the community, visit womenshapingai.com.
Awesome. Is there any final questions, comments that you want to make? Just putting it out there to the group. Is there anything from Hacking HR's perspective that you wanted to say while we're here? Put you in the hot seat.
I think that if I had to leave everyone with one final thought, it would be that most organizations don't have an innovation problem or a shortage of ideas. They have a system problem.
Yeah.
So think about what is the system that you've designed, and is it innovation friendly?
Mm-hmm.
Is it designed for an exploit or an explore environment? And go from there and think about how you can focus on fewer priorities, faster learning, clear decision rights, more trust, and better systems, repeatable systems that will guide your innovation.
Yeah. No, beautiful. And as I said, we have got a calendar of events that we're working on. If you join our pod, you'll be able to keep across that. The beauty is too, I believe, and I haven't played with it yet, so I don't want to talk out of school, but that we've got the mechanism to actually communicate, I think, directly as well too, which will be good. So we'll be able to have some more one-on-one conversations, which will be important. But yeah, you'll find me, Ali Uren, on LinkedIn and also at kickstart.com. So please, if there's anything, Brazil, if you want to say anything, then please let us know what's happening. If there's anything that you think would be good for us to get across from a Hacking HR perspective, then let us know. But again, this is the beginning of our learning pod journey, and really hope that you come along and be part of that and shape it with us. And as we do more, we learn more. And we then have a responsibility to go out there and do it. But yeah, final point, it's never about just the tech. It's always about the relationships, the conditions, the environments, the process, the system. Start thinking in an interconnected ecosystem. And that's what Malvika's allowed us to have today in terms of those 6 pillars, which we'll be sharing, yeah? And thanks again, everyone. Enjoy. As I said, I'm just at the beginning of my day today, but you are probably at your end, and then now we're in the middle of the night. So thank you so much for the opportunity to join, and we'll be sharing the recording as well too.
Thank you so much, Ali. This was a great conversation. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you.
Be well.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.